Hello, everyone. I'm Robert Seiger for the Kosmos Society, an online community for the exploration and study of the ancient world, guided by traditional classical studies, modern online tools, and our interest in the ancient Greek world. Membership to the Cosmos Society is by application at our website and is open to all interested people, and there is no cost. Among other learning activities, we offer reading groups for original ancient Greek and Latin works, both in English translation and in the original language. We particularly encourage non-professionals to seek a welcoming environment for learning and discussion. Today, we are here for Cosmos Society's Open House Conversation Series, periodic discussion we hold with interesting leaders in the study of the ancient. And today, I'd like to welcome our guest, Professor James Romm. He'll be talking today on his recent book, Plato and the Tyrant: The Fall of Greece's Greatest Dynasty and the Making of a Philosophic Masterpiece, was just released, I believe, in 2025. Professor Romm is the James Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics at Bard College. Um, he's been described as both a classicist and a historian. I'm not sure when he describes himself that way. He's the author of numerous books in ancient Greek history and culture, writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, and the Wall Street Journal. Prior to this book, Joe and the Tyrant, he edited a series on Seneca, How to Have a Life, an Ancient Guide to Using Our Time Wisely, 2022, and Demetria, Sacker of Cities from 2023. So before you begin, Professor, I did want to ask you a thing we like to ask all our speakers, which is, how did you first become interested in classics or the ancient world?
Well, let me first thank the Cosmos Society for this invitation and this opportunity to talk to you about my book and my work. And let me say, this is the ideal audience for me. Uh, Mature people who have enough interest, enough commitment to learn Greek, to read Greek, and who can evaluate some of my arguments because some of them depend on knowing about the ancient world. So I welcome your comments, critiques, counter arguments, whatever you'd like to offer um, at the end of my talk. So to answer your question, I was very lucky to be accepted to a program at Yale where I was an undergraduate called Directed Studies, and it still exists. It's a marvelous program. It means that as a freshman, you take three interconnected courses in the humanities, one on history, one on literature, one on philosophy, and it's by invitation only. It's a selective program, and I at first didn't want to join. My parents luckily made me do it. They said, if you're invited to a selected program, you're going to join. And uh, the first semester, we read entirely works in Greek, works from the Greeks, in translation, of course. And that was enough to turn my head and convince me that this was the best way I could study the humanities, was through the Greek world. So I learned Greek my sophomore year, and I only did Greek at college. I was a Greek major without any Latin, and I had to learn Latin in an immersion program in the summer to catch up, and then went to grad school in comparative literature.
Thank you. We would like to, can you share your screen? If you
Sure.
have a presentation, I'll let you get
Yeah.
started. We'll go
Yeah.
to questions after. Thank you.
Okay. All right. All right. Can everyone see my share? Okay. So this is the painting with which I open my book, Plato and the Tyrant. It's a fantasy. It's not an actual Renaissance painting, but it's it's someone imagining what the Florentine Academy of the Renaissance would have looked like when they were celebrating Plato's birthday, as we know that they did, on the day in November that was associated with his birth. And that's Marsilio Ficino in the middle, and he's lifting his hand over the bust of Plato as if in a kind of ritual gesture of uh, uh, it's a gesture with religious significance. So the Florentine Academy of the 15th century was founded in imitation of Plato's Academy and made Plato into a kind of a patron saint, uh, offering gifts to the statue and celebrating his birthday with hymns and eulogies. I use this painting to show that Plato's reputation in the West, ever since the Renaissance, has been of a semi-divine figure. He has been almost apotheosized as the leading thinker of the Greek world and really the foundation stone of all Western philosophy. The famous remark of Bernard Russell is that all Western philosophy are footnotes on Plato. Um, he has an almost untouchable veneer of sanctity. But that veneer has prevented, I believe, the serious treatment of the documents that show him in a less flattering light, namely the Platonic Letters. So if you haven't come across the Platonic Letters yet, they're fascinating reading. They're not widely available because some scholars believe them to be spurious. And we can get into the arguments for and against their authenticity. My thesis is that the scales have been weighted against them from the beginning because of this sanctification of Plato, that we don't, especially scholars who specialize in Plato, don't want to look at him in a human light, a light that shows his mistakes, his flaws, his efforts to exculpate himself after having made mistakes, which is what I think the letters are really all about. And the mistakes that he made are the ones that I describe in my book, his voyages to Syracuse and his efforts to reform an autocratic regime that was in power there. So I'll talk more about his adventure, his misadventure in Syracuse. But first, let me say more about the letters because it's a fascinating scholarly problem as to how to determine whether they are genuine or not. Here's another image that I'm sure we're all familiar with. It comes from the Vatican, from the famous School of Athens fresco. This is just a close-up of the image of Plato from that fresco. And of course, it's highly idealized. Um, these two book covers are meant to show that the letters have been really shoved under the rug. In the 1970s, the Penguin Classics published an edition of the the Phaedrus, which included letters 7 and 8, the two longest and most important of the letters. There are 13 altogether in the collection. In a subsequent edition in 2007, they republished the Phaedrus without the letters, without explanation as to what had happened to them. And I believe, I can't prove this, but I believe that they excised them because of the controversy over their authenticity, just not wanting to get involved in that, not wanting to publish them under the name Plato, implying that they really are his work. Here's an interesting, okay, so this is another edition. Some of you may own this, the Bolingen Plato um, from the 1940s. And this collection, as you can see, is the collected dialogues, including the letters in smaller font. and the letters are relegated to an appendix where the editors do not annotate or introduce the letters so that they're not given the same status as the dialogues. They're pushed off to the side, but nevertheless, they are included. At least some of them, not all of them. So this is a fascinating chart that was compiled in the 1980s by a man named Luc Brisson, a French scholar. And in order to assess the position of the scholarly field on the letters, he tabulated all the monographs that he could find going back to Ficino in the Renaissance up to his own day. And you see across the top, there's Roman numerals going from 1 to 13. So those represent the 13 letters. And for each one, he's assessed the author's position as to authenticity, with a 0 indicating disbelief, rejection of Platonic authorship, a 1 indicating doubt, not certain, and 2 indicating I believe it to be genuine. You can see from this chart how various the positions have been. We start off in the Renaissance with almost all twos, that is to say, every letter considered genuine, except in the case of Ficino, the first and the 13th. And then immediately in the 19th century, we get all zeros. So things flip-flopped from belief to disbelief. Then we go back to a set of all twos in the early 20th century. And from there, it gets very mixed and jumbled. You can see if you look down the middle column, the column marked 7, that almost all scholars across time have believed in the authenticity of the 7th letter, which is by far the most important one. It's the longest, it's longer even than some of the dialogues. And it has a very detailed account of Plato's involvement in Syracuse. So this is my principal source in the book. You can see I'm not going terribly far out on a limb by using that because most scholars over time have agreed that it's genuine. The biggest recent exception is the one that I've added down to the bottom. The final line at the bottom is my own edition, a book that was published in 2015 by 2 extremely prominent Oxford scholars of philosophy, Michael Freda and Miles Berniate. And its very title is The Pseudo-Platonic 7th Letter. So right from the title page, they reject the authenticity of the 7th letter, and they go to great lengths to prove their thesis. I believe that book is badly mistaken and indicative of the bias that especially scholars of philosophy have against the letters. Historians, interestingly, are much more willing to accept them. So there's been a divide in the field between historical approaches and ones based on philosophic content. I could have added more lines to this chart in the last 5 years, and forthcoming in next year are a set of books, I think there's 6 altogether, that defend the authenticity of the 7th letter as well as some of the others. And I include my own, which accepts 5 letters as genuine and doesn't, I don't take any position on the others, but there are 5 that are central to my argument, to my narrative. Um, so the pendulum perhaps has swung back the other way. And what's fascinating is that Freda and Berniate in 2015 said that this book would close the door forever on the debate on the 7th letter. They thought, QED, there cannot be any more discussion. But clearly, the other scholars in the field have not accepted that position. There's the cover of their book. So you can see they wore their skepticism like a flag. Um, I include this slide just to show you the tradition of the apotheosis, the divinization of Plato. This was the title of his collected works in Marsilio Ficino's translation for a couple of centuries across Western Europe. Divini Platonis Opera Omnia, the collected works of the divine Plato. So again, the title is indicative of the bias. Um, so I showed you in the table compiled by Brisson that Ficino had excised the first and the 13th letter. The first letter, so there are 13 altogether that come down to us in the collection by a man named Thrasyllus. Some of you may be familiar with what's called the Thrasylean canon. So in the first century BC, a Greek scholar named Thrasyllus compiled the works of Plato into a canon, divided them into tetralogies, and included 13 letters in his corpus, in the Platonic corpus. There are other letters attributed to Plato that are not among those 13 that are certainly fakes. And we know that some ancient authors, some forgers, did compose fake letters from Plato and from other great philosophers because they wanted to sell them to libraries. There was a strong profit motive behind the forgery business. And there's also a tradition of training rhetoricians by having them write letters in the style of Plato as one would write to a tyrant of Syracuse, for example, to take historical situations and have the students compose a letter. What would you say in that situation? So there's good reason to suspect any letter from antiquity, but for reasons I'll get into, I believe that the five letters that I deal with are genuine. Here's a sentence that you may have come across, oops, if you've read The Republic. It's said to be the most famous sentence in all of Plato by the editor of the Loeb Plato, Paul Shorey. Unless philosophers become kings in the cities, or unless those now termed kings and rulers truly practice philosophy, there will be no cessation of troubles for the cities, or I think for the human race. It's a very dramatic sentence indicating that Plato, when he wrote the Republic, really saw political life in Greece going downhill fast. And the Republic is largely his effort to rescue political life from that slide, to turn things around. And the philosopher king, that is, an autocrat who had been trained to practice philosophy and to see what Plato called the forms, see the absolute essence of justice, courage, virtue, would be the best kind of ruler and would set up a philosophic society like the one portrayed in the Republic. Interestingly, a version of this same sentence also is found in the seventh letter. Not quite the same wording, but really the same idea that there are two paths to salvation of humankind. Either a king has to be made philosophic, or a philosopher has to be made a king. Um, and Plato indicates in the seventh letter, that was my reason for going to Syracuse. Well, what he says is, with these thoughts in mind, I made my journey to Syracuse. That's his only explanation for why he left Athens in 388 when he was about 40 years old. And for the first time that we know of, that he left the city and went to the Greek West, to southern Italy, which was entirely colonized by Greeks, and to eastern Sicily, which was also Greek settled. We know that he met in southern Italy with the philosopher Archytas of Tarentum, a Pythagorean philosopher who later became leader of that city and perhaps fulfills the first of these conditions, that a philosopher became a king, not quite a king, but an executive power, and then went to Syracuse in Sicily, the most powerful Greek state of its day. In spite of our sources that focus on Athens and Sparta, Syracuse had, by the 4th century BC, become more powerful than either of those cities, and met with the ruler there, a man named Dianicius, who quite possibly Plato might have thought could fulfill the second of these conditions, that is, a king or a ruler could be taught to practice philosophy. So this journey in 388 is the first of three journeys that Plato made to Syracuse over the course of his adult life. He went there first at age 40 in 388, visiting a tyrant who had been in power for about 15 years by that time, and had established an extremely powerful and um, uh, repressive regime. Then went back 20 years later, 366, and then finally 5 years after that in 361. So three journeys over the course of about 25 years, when Plato was ages 40 to 65, all during which time, I argue in my book, he was also writing the Republic. Republic is, we can tell by certain stylistic features, seams and splices, was a composite work composed over a long period of time, perhaps 4 decades. And there's an ancient legend, probably apocryphal, but still perhaps based on some kernel of truth, that on his deathbed, Plato was still using a tablet to rearrange the words of the first sentence of the Republic in order to get them just perfect, that he was still revising even up to his last hour. So my book attempts to um, uh, describe these three voyages using the letters as my principal source, and the after effects, which were disastrous for both Plato and Syracuse in the 350s BC, right up to the time of Plato's death in 348, and juxtapose that narrative with an account of the Republic and its doctrine of the philosopher king, and to suggest that there's a close relationship between the two, that Plato's journeys to Syracuse were motivated in part by the thesis of the Republic that philosophy was necessary for good governance, and was also influenced by his encounters with not just Dianicius the elder, the man who he first met in 388, but that man's son, Dianicius the younger, who took power in 366. The tyrant of my title really refers to Dianicius the younger because Plato spent much more time with him, and we have a much clearer account of what their interactions were. But we begin first with Dianicius the elder, and a much briefer and much less well attested encounter in 388. So there's my cover. It's a painting of what's called the Letomii, the caverns that were hollowed out of the native limestone of Syracusa by um, uh, as a stone quarry, supplying the stones that built the walls around Syracuse and some of its buildings. And it's a magnificent cavern. You can visit it today, and it's called the Ear of Dionicious, in Italian, L'Orecchio di Dionissio, um, based on a legend that first arose when the painter Caravaggio visited in the 17th century and thought that the shape of the cavern was like an ear. This is an interior view. here's what it looks like from the outside. So you can see that it does have a certain resemblance to an ear. And Caravaggio had the disturbing idea that Dianicius put his political prisoners inside there because he could listen from the top, and the acoustics were such that even if they just whispered to each other, he could hear what they were saying. So he could detect any conspiracy among the prisoners inside. That's a modern fantasy, but it does correspond to what we know of Dionysius the Elder, that he took power around 404 BC from what was then a democracy. Syracuse had been a democracy for decades, but um, through manipulation of the populace and um, uh, uh, his charismatic oratory, he was able to seize power, get a bodyguard, surround himself with military force, and establish a tyranny, an autocratic regime. So I don't want to push this point too hard, but we all know that the Republic contains a famous allegory about a cave. That is to say, Plato describes human life in the Republic as existence within a cave in which we're prisoners looking at shadows on the wall cast by the light of a fire. That is, we're misled by our sense perceptions, by the physical world around us, and we make false judgments based on what we see and hear. If we're trained in philosophy, and the training takes decades and requires serious commitment over the course of one's entire adult life, uh, it's possible to get outside the cave and behold a world lit by sun. And the sun in this allegory corresponds to the form of the good. So Plato's forms, the most central theory of his philosophy, um, is that we cannot learn from things around us because they're transitory, they decay, they have no permanence, and they vary from one to another. If you draw circles with your hand, you'd get a different kind of circle every time. But we know that there is something called circle, which is permanent, perfect, unchanging, and follows absolutely consistent mathematical laws. If we train our mind on that circle and not on any circle we could draw with the hand, we would understand what circle is. And from that, one sees how the the slogan that was associated with the academy, "No one should enter here who doesn't know geometry," got formed because geometry trains the mind to look only at perfect and eternal things and not at physical things. So if you extend that principle from circles and squares to concepts like justice and beauty, if we don't look at earthly examples of justice, court cases, precedent, law codes, but train our minds on an absolute and unchanging ideal of justice. That is the only way we could learn what true justice is and inform our souls so as to follow principles of justice invariably. The subtitle of the Republic is On Justice. So its central question is, what is justice and does it make one happy? That is, why would one practice justice if doing injustice was, if one could get away with any sort of crime without getting caught and amass wealth, commit rape, murder one's opponents, do whatever one wanted, wouldn't that be better the life of a tyrant, essentially, and the Republic, through the voice of Socrates, sets out to demonstrate no, it's justice that makes one happier. In fact, 729 times happier than injustice. And there's a mathematical formula for that differential. So there's a cave at the heart of the Republic. There's a cave at the heart of Syracuse, this cavern of the Latomii. And I can't prove this, of course, but I do suggest in the book that Plato was thinking about caves because of his visit to Dianicius the Elder and the use of a cavern for political repression. So Dianicius was a immensely powerful autocrat. He surrounded himself with armed force that he hired using his great wealth. Um, Mostly non-Greek soldiers, so as to make them more loyal and less problematic, and then built up a impregnable position on a place called the Island, which originally was an island, but then was connected to Syracuse by a causeway. So it's a peninsula off of the coast of Syracuse that's connected just by a narrow isthmus, and which was easily walled off. And he fortified this place, stocked it with weapons and food, and housed his immense hired army there so as to be invincible, so that the population, even if it rose up against him, could really do nothing to oust him. And this is typical of the Greek tyrants of the fourth century, that they all try to seize these central or fortified positions within their cities and then become de facto rulers, if not de jure. This painting, very amusing, shows that he was so paranoid of assassination that he refused to let a barber come near him with a blade, and he resorted to having his daughters singe off his whiskers using a heated walnut shell. So there would be nothing sharp that came near his throat. So this is Dionysius getting shorn or singed by his daughter, with the other daughter in the background. He had two daughters from one wife and a third from a second wife. So Dionysius practiced polygamy like the great rulers of Persia, the great kings of Persia. It was not a Greek custom, but he imported it from the East. He imported other trappings of the Persian monarchy, purple robes, diadem, um, and did not call himself a king, called himself archon, which is a much vaguer term, meant adopted so as not to alarm the other Greeks as to his monarchic ambitions. But in other ways, his practice of polygamy being one, he imitated the great kings of Persia, and he was put into a parallel in a speech by the orator Lysias in 388, the very year that Plato first went to Syracuse. Lysias said, "We have the Persian great king on one side of us, and we have the tyrant of Syracuse on the other. And so we're in grave danger from both." So that parallel shows that they were really thought of as equivalent in power. Dionysius had to fund his enormous army, and he did so by a number of financial tricks and stratagems, which are described by Aristotle in a work that we're fortunate to have, or perhaps a student of Aristotle, the Economics, has a long discussion of Dionysius's financial manipulations, including the issuance of bronze coins. So you see one of his bronze coins here, but the use of them to pay off debts as if they were silver. So we we have all kinds of currency manipulation today, you know, cryptocurrencies and so on. And this is an early example of that kind of manipulation. He forced the assembly to say these bronze coins will be accepted at the value of silver. His silver coins, which were largely meant to attract mercenary labor, skilled soldiers into his armed forces, are among the most beautiful produced in any Greek city ever. In fact, I think this coin is really the most beautiful coin. It's a 10 drachma piece. So the 10 drachma piece was invented at Syracuse, again, as a way to attract hired soldiers. And therefore, it gives a broader surface area and can be engraved in greater detail. And this engraving of the four-horse chariot team is really extraordinary. And the charioteer being crowned by the figure of Nike. And on the other side, the nymph Arethusa. So the legend was that the spring of fresh water that was found on the island, this peninsula off of the coast of Syracuse, was um, uh, was originally the was a place where the nymph Arethusa had emerged after traveling through an underground conduit from Greece. So there was a connection there between Syracuse and the Greek world. Syracuse was a colony of Corinth originally, by the way. Um, so it's still today called the Fonte Aretusa, this freshwater spring on the island. And you see that she's surrounded by dolphins. So that's a sort of symbolic representation of the freshwater spring with salt water all around it. The island is a very small place, and yet there's a pool of fresh water right in the middle of it. So let me say a few words about another character in my story, another principal at the court of Syracuse, a man named Dion, or on the audio tape, I hear they pronounce it Dion. I think either is correct. Dion is probably more correct, but I'm used to saying Dion, so I'll stick with that. So Dion's sister had married Dianicius the elder. He was one of the tyrant's two wives. The tyrant married two at the same time and consummated the two unions on the same night and kept secret which one was first so that he could choose, right? If both women conceived, he could choose which heir he wanted. Well, in the end, it was um, only one wife conceived and had a son whom he named after himself, Dianicius the Younger. On the other side, the the wife who only had children later uh, was Dion. So Dion was both uh, a marital, he was related by marriage to the tyrant's house and also not in the direct line of succession. That is, his nephew, who was eventually, when his sister eventually had children, his nephew was much junior to the heir apparent on the other side. So Dion was out of power in two ways. But he was also the most talented and most trusted statesman among the royal family, if you like. That put him in a very peculiar position where he was asked to do some of the central tasks of governance, but was not considered a possible heir, nor were his nephews. It's that paradox or that dissonance that created the problem that leads to the crisis that my book describes. The crisis being a split in the royal house that resulted in a civil war in Syracuse that destroyed much of the city and caused the fall of the dynasty. Dion became a devoted student of Plato. When Plato visited in 388, The two of them formed a very close bond based on shared philosophic ideals and also a bond of love, as I argue in my book. There's a poem of Plato. Again, the authorship is contested, but accepted by me and other experts, that in which Plato says that Dion, you drove my soul mad with eros. So those of you who are reading the symposium right now would be very interested in this poem because he describes himself as feeling eros for Dion and a kind of madness. Does this mean a philosophic eros like the one that Diotima preaches in the symposium, that is non-sexual and devoted toward shared philosophic pursuits? Maybe. Maybe it's a true sexual bond, as the term eros usually implies. It's impossible to know that. But nevertheless, it seems that they had a very strong and emotional bond right from the get-go, from the first time they met in 388. That bond was perceived by the rest of the court and eventually by Dianicius the Younger as a threat to the regime. Dion was out of power, yet also highly skilled at governance, a possible usurper. His nephews were candidates for succession if the heir apparent were to be jumped over. There were reasons to mistrust Dion apart from from his bond with Plato. But when that bond became apparent to the members of the court, it created intense mistrust. And Dion was eventually exiled from Syracuse because he was thought of as a traitor to the regime. And Plato's presence in the city had a lot to do with that mistrust. I'm just fetching my clock because I see I'm already at about 40 minutes and I'm not supposed to go past, I'm supposed to leave time for questions. So uh, I think I've given you enough of a sense of the story that I could move to questions. But let me just say, I'm only at about the halfway point. The action gets fast and furious as Dion, in an effort to retake his position and his estate that had been confiscated from him, invades Syracuse with an army, ousts the ruler from power, and begins a civil war that lasts for years and reduces Syracuse really to rubble. And Plato is looking on from the sidelines from Athens during this entire stretch and in an apparent a mood of despair because he recognized that he was partly responsible for the breakdown and tried his best in his letters to A, solve the problems of Syracuse, get them on a better footing, and B, exculpate himself from what had become a political disaster. So let me leave it there and I'll stop sharing and I'll be happy to entertain your questions or comments.
Let's thank our speaker. Excellent. So, before we dive into questions, I just want to comment that I, I was in Syracuse in March, and I had a chance to go to that cave you mentioned. It's fascinating, as you say. I wish I'd seen your book before then. I would appreciate it even more. I was surprised at how little the Italians presented these treasures compared to if the same things were in Greece. But so I have a question for you, and then I'll uh, go on to everybody else. Um, this question of authenticity. We have a lot of computation tools now that people talk about using for textual analysis and pattern analysis and stuff like this. Have these tools been applied more recently, say, than the 80s or 60s, to this question of the authenticity of these couple of long letters?
Yes, but not conclusively.
Okay.
So the problem is that the style of a letter is inevitably different than the style of a dialogue. And so we have a body of letters and we have a body of dialogues, but the computer can't really say, that the author of the two is the same because the style would inevitably be different. Um, the most interesting study by computer, to my mind, is that of a man named Gerald Ledger. I think it was published in 1990, who tried to find a stylistic measure that would not change between genres, that is, would be constant between the letters and the dialogues. And he used a metric based on the frequency of the final two letters of every word. It sounds nutty, but testing it against other authors where we know which works are genuine and which are not, it does hold up most of the time. Not absolutely, but most of the time, it can detect consistency even across genres. And he applied that to the letters. He decided that there are only a few letters that are long enough to permit this analysis to be used, and he decided that those long letters, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, were genuine. And he was fairly convinced that the 13th was also genuine, but he wasn't as sure. So, and my book considers 3, 4, 7, 8, and 13 to be genuine. So I don't cite him as an authority because there's controversy over whether his method is valid. But I think it's just one more piece of evidence that, inclines toward authenticity. One can never prove authenticity. So I concede that there can be no proof. But you can't prove that Plato wrote the Symposium, right? What proof could there be? There's no empirical evidence. So all these matters of authenticity are ultimately a judgment call.
Right, great. Thank you. So I saw a hand up somewhere, but I don't see it now. Would invite uh, questions from our group. Bill,
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I don't know a lot about Syracuse. I have to look up more. So I was wondering about the time span. Why was it 20 years between the first and second visit?
So the second visit in 366 followed after the death of Dianicius the Elder and the accession of Dianicius the Younger, who was 30 years old at the time he came to power and had not received much of an education as a young man. His father had apparently kept him kind of in seclusion. Um, Dion, who was some 20 years older than well, no, about 10 years older than the ruler, um, convinced him if you want to really be a legitimate ruler, you need Plato's instruction.
Oh,
And the two of them together, Dionysius and Dion, wrote to Plato and invited him back. And we know from Dion's letter that he promised Plato, or he enticed Plato with the idea that the thesis of the Republic could now be put into practice. That is, we can really have a philosopher king. We can have someone who's in power, who is trained in philosophy. So let's give it a shot. And that's what enticed Plato to come back.
very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
yeah, I saw you had a question. You're muted.
Yes, thank you. Professor, you said that Plato felt that the political life of Greece was declining in the fourth century.
Mhm.
Um, I understand he was disappointed with his relatives' activities during the period of the 30, but were there any other actions during the first half of the fourth century that would have uh, contributed to that discontent or disillusion?
Mhm. So, as you say, the 30 that was led by Plato's great uncle, I believe it is, Critias, had dismayed Plato that a right-wing authoritarian government committed horrible abuses and made horrible mistakes, then was replaced by a resurgent democracy the following year. And that democracy very soon after presided over the execution of Socrates. So he says at the beginning of the seventh letter, I I became disenchanted with authoritarian rule after the 30, and then with democratic rule after my friend Socrates was killed. And I decided that neither system was working. He says, I experienced ilingia. Since you're all readers of Greek, I can use Greek words. He experienced an ilingia, which is a word that is usually used of a vertigo one feels from looking down from a great height. He felt sick to his stomach at the way that Greek politics was declining.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Thank you.
Cloudy, please.
Sorry, my name seems to have disappeared. I want to go over what you said towards the end. You said in 361, Plato was looking from the side at the downfall of Syracuse, thinking of how to better the situation, etc. But what could he do? What could he do from Athens?
So that's that's a great question. It's actually the 350s when Syracuse fell apart
Okay,
and
350s.
descended
Okay.
into chaos.
Yeah.
And in that chaos, Dion was assassinated. Dion, who had taken power in most of the city, was assassinated by some of his officers. Plato writes the seventh and eighth letter, the two longest letters, to the friends and followers of Dion. That is the faction that still supported Dion's cause and included the relatives of Dion. And they're reaching out, their responses to letters that had come from those people asking for help. So the Dion faction thought of Plato as still being able to help them, even from Athens. And his letters are giving advice, among other things that they try to accomplish. They give advice about how to proceed and what kind of regime to put in place if they were able to seize power.
Mm.
So he's working from Athens by letter to try to correct the situation, try to get Syracuse back on track.
Mm. Thank you. How long would it take to go from Athens to Syracuse at the time?
So assuming one has good sailing weather,
Mm.
it's a voyage of only a week or so.
Okay.
It's a journey of only a week or so. The problem is that during much of the year, sailing through the central Mediterranean is impossible, is too risky for Greek triremes. So the sailing season ends in the fall and opens again in the spring. And Plato was trapped in Syracuse during two of these off seasons when sailing became impossible.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Helen.
Thank you, thank you. I really enjoyed that. I'm just wondering why you think this letter is genuine, this seventh letter. You kind of asserted it, and it sounds as though it's about the consistency with the context, the rest of the historical context.
Mhm.
Is that your main reason?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or to elaborate on that, the way in which the rhetorical strategies of the letter are very intimately keyed to the situation in Syracuse and Plato's relationship to it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one can always posit that a genius forger could recreate those strategies, could, imagine the situation so fully as to come up with that kind of subtlety. That can never be refuted. That possibility can't be dismissed. But it's much more likely, since the works come down to us as Plato's works, and we have, by the way, a scrap of papyrus, not from the seventh letter, but from the eighth letter, that puts its date, that shows it was in circulation very early, that is, the early 3rd century, maybe only 50 years or so after the time when it would have been written if it's genuine. And that strongly inclines towards genuineness, because the later in time you go, the more chance there is of forgery. So the eighth letter was on the scene already, only a few decades after Plato's death. Yeah, one can't prove authenticity. I freely concede that. It's a judgment call, and I think the weight of evidence is strongly on the side of genuineness. It's a question of voice, persona, rhetorical strategy, and also the problem of who would have composed such a long letter and faked it as Plato's work. Why would someone do that? We have a lot of forged letters, and they're all rather short because a forger doesn't want to go on at length.
Yes. Yes.
The longer you go, the more chance there is you'll make a mistake and give yourself away.
Yes.
Why would someone compose a letter longer than a dialogue?
Yes. Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Helen, last question for you. Thanks.
Yes, first, thank you so much for this great presentation. Very interesting. I was wondering were the letters quoted or used by letter writers? I'm thinking of Diogenes Laertius, who wrote a biography of Plato.
Mhm.
Do you think that we can pinpoint that some of them used quotes or passages from the letters?
Mm-hmm. Well, Cicero already is quoting from them, or quoting Latin translations of them in the first century BC. So that's considerably earlier than Diogenes. Plutarch, who's about contemporary with Diogenes Laertius, uses them in his Life of Dion. And so, and no one in antiquity questioned their authenticity. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's answered.
That's fascinating. So I do want to point out to everybody, the letters are on Perseus. So
Yes,
you do have access to the Greek. So
that's right. And also in the Loeb Classical Library, which is now online if you buy a subscription.
So let's thank our speaker again. Excellent. We just really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So much
Thank
fun.
you for having me. It's
Really
Very,
a
very
fun.
interesting.
pleasure to meet you all.